In the lavish halls of the 19th century European royalty, where power and privilege hid the deepest secrets, one young princess would learn that fairy tales can turn into nightmares. Princess Stephanie of Belgium stepped into marriage filled with dreams of love and duty. But soon, she found herself ensnared in a horrific mix of disease, betrayal, and violent tragedy. Her story isn't one of happily ever afters, but a glimpse into a life forever marked by the man meant to protect her. It was 1881 when 17-year-old Stephanie married Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary, heir to one of Europe's mightiest empires. What should have been the start of a beautiful royal partnership spiraled into her own personal hell. Just a year in, Rudolf infected his young bride with syphilis, a disease that robbed her of her ability to bear children and condemned her to constant pain and social shame. But the worst betrayal was still ahead. In 1889, when Stephanie was only 24, Rudolf's jealousy boiled over in a hunting lodge at Mayerling. He murdered his teenage mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera, before turning the gun on himself. In an instant, Stephanie became a widow and the center of scandal, facing whispers that would haunt her for the rest of her life. This isn't just about a failed marriage. It's a tragic account of how disease, murder, and death shattered one woman's existence. It uncovers the harsh truths hidden behind the veil of imperial splendor, where women were mere pawns in political games, and their pain stayed locked away. Stephanie's sorrow is a stark reminder that even in the lap of luxury, power can corrupt, and love can turn deadly. Her journey starts in the grand courts of Europe, where marriages were arranged to secure alliances, and young women were treated as assets. But it ends in solitude, with her memoirs halting at the moment of her greatest heartbreak, as if some wounds can never truly heal. This is the untold story of a princess betrayed, a woman broken, and a life forever altered by the actions of a man who should have defended her. The Habsburg dynasty, steeped in tradition and duty, welcomed Princess Stephanie, young and hopeful, into its fold. Unprepared for the dark times ahead, her story would turn into a cautionary tale about the costs of power. It shows us just how devastating it can be when power is used without morals or limits. This isn't just one woman's tale of suffering. It's a reminder of how disease, violence, and scandal can ruin lives, even among the elite. It pushes us to face uncomfortable truths about marriage, power, and how women were often seen as disposable in the quest for political and personal gain. In the late 19th century, the Austrian Empire was one of Europe's last great multinational dynasties. It stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, home to many ethnic groups and cultures. At its center was Vienna, a dazzling capital where waltzes filled the ballrooms and the Habsburgs upheld centuries-old traditions. But beneath this polished surface, the empire was crumbling under the pressures of nationalism, social change, and decay. Crown Prince Rudolf, born in 1858, was set to inherit this vast but troubled land. His education was tough, aimed at preparing him for the weight of ruling millions, but the pressure from his father, Emperor Franz Joseph, along with his strict ways, shaped Rudolf into a complicated and often unstable person. He was smart and charming, yet he struggled with depression and reckless behavior that worried the conservative court. Marriage was a key part of European diplomacy, and Rudolf's wedding was more about politics than love. Princess Stephanie of Belgium, born in 1864, was chosen for the strategic benefits her marriage would bring to both royal families. This alliance would boost Austria-Hungary's status in Western Europe and give Belgium a strong ally against possible threats from France or Germany. The wedding preparations in 1881 were lavish, filled with months of discussions over dowries, protocols, and ceremony. At just 17, Stephanie found herself thrown into a world of strict court rules and political maneuvering, a far cry from the sheltered life she'd known. She came to Vienna with dreams of marriage and the role of crown princess, completely unaware of what lay ahead. Stephanie was stepping into a world that would soon feel like a cage, filled with strict rules and personal betrayal. The Habsburg court was all about traditions, carrying on customs that dictated everything from morning meetings to evening events. New brides had to quickly adapt to these expectations while also having children to ensure the family's future. For Stephanie, this meant letting go of much of her Belgian roots and bowing to the authority of her husband and his family. It was a tough and ultimately tragic adjustment. In the 1880s, the political climate added even more strain to royal marriages. The empire was dealing with rising nationalist movements, economic troubles, and a tangled web of alliances across Europe that would lead to World War I. Crown Prince Rudolf had to navigate all this while keeping the dignity of the Habsburg name intact, which took a toll on his mental health and led to increasingly erratic behavior. Back then, royal marriages were nothing like today's ideas of love and partnership. Women were seen mainly as tools for political alliances and producing heirs. Their own happiness was often pushed aside for their roles in society. This system had lasted for centuries but was starting to show cracks, although not fast enough to spare Princess Stephanie from its harsh realities. In the early days of their marriage, Stephanie and Rudolf put on a happy front for the public, with carefully planned appearances and positive media coverage hiding the issues brewing behind palace doors. Unfortunately, Rudolf's treatment of his young bride quickly showed a pattern of selfishness, cruelty, and indifference to her well-being. What started as chilly behavior turned into emotional abuse and, ultimately, betrayal through infidelity. Rudolf contracted syphilis, a disease in the 1880s that felt like a slow death sentence. It could lay dormant for years, silently wreaking havoc on its victims. For women, this was especially harsh, as the infection often led to infertility, miscarriages, and serious complications that could make pregnancy risky or entirely impossible. When Rudolf infected Stephanie with syphilis, he wasn't just breaking their marriage vows, he was dooming her to a life of pain and shattered dreams of motherhood. Back then, people didn't really understand how syphilis spread, but everyone knew it carried a huge social stigma. Women who got the disease, even accidentally, were often blamed and shunned. For a crown princess, whose main job was to have heirs, being unable to conceive because of her husband's betrayal wasn't just a personal loss. It could spark a political crisis for the dynasty that relied on a clear line of succession. Rudolf's behavior became more reckless as he struggled with his mental health in the 1880s. He had numerous affairs with women from all walks of life, showing little care for discretion or the fallout. Throughout this time, he treated Stephanie as if she were just a barrier to his enjoyment. Her suffering meant nothing to him. Trapped in a marriage filled with humiliation and danger, Stephanie couldn't openly talk about her husband's behavior or ask for help due to strict royal protocols. She was expected to keep up a happy front while battling a disease that was slowly tearing her apart and crushing her hopes for the future. The isolation that came with her suffering was perhaps just as cruel as the illness itself. Royal women were told to bear their struggles in silence, and discussing personal marital issues was seen as improper and could hurt the monarchy's reputation. With no allies at court willing to stand by her against the crown prince, Stephanie felt utterly defenseless against his ongoing abuse and neglect. As Rudolf's actions grew more erratic and public, she watched helplessly as his promiscuity threatened not just her health, but the stability of the empire she had married into. The young woman who arrived in Vienna, filled with dreams of love and purpose, found herself turned into a tragic figure, trapped by the very marriage that was supposed to bring her joy. In the winter of 1888 to 1889, everything started to unravel for Princess Stephanie. Her husband, Crown Prince Rudolf, had become obsessed with a 17-year-old girl named Baroness Mary Wetzer. Mary was young, beautiful, and part of the minor nobility. She got swept up in Rudolf's chaotic life. This affair wasn't just another betrayal. It was the start of a dark spiral that would shock all of Europe and turn Stephanie's world upside down. By this time, Rudolf was struggling mentally. People around him noticed his growing paranoia, wild outbursts, and clear disconnect from reality. His views had turned radical, putting him at odds with his conservative father and the traditional empire. All this pressure, combined with guilt over how he treated Stephanie and fear of his secrets being exposed, created an explosive situation. Rudolf sought escape in a hunting lodge at Merling, deep in the Vienna woods. Here he let loose with raucous parties and debauchery. In January of 1889, he took Mary to the lodge, seemingly for a hunting trip, but it became the final chapter of his life. The isolation of the lodge was perfect for the tragedy that was about to unfold. Away from prying eyes, on January 30th of 1889, the staff at the lodge discovered the lifeless bodies of Crown Prince Rudolf and Baroness Mary Wetzer in his bedroom. Rudolf had shot Mary before turning the gun on himself. It was a murder-suicide that sent shockwaves through the Habsburg Empire and beyond. Immediately, chaos erupted as court officials scrambled to control the narrative and handle the scandal that could destabilize the monarchy. The official story spun by the Habsburgs claimed Rudolf died of a heart attack, and Mary's presence was just a coincidence. But the truth was too dramatic to hide. Within days, whispers of murder and suicide spread through Vienna and across Europe. The scandal surrounding the Habsburg dynasty would linger for years. For Princess Stephanie, her husband's death was the peak of a long struggle filled with pain and betrayal. At just 24, she was not only a widow, but also the target of harsh judgment and gossip regarding her part in this tragedy. Some people said she pushed Rudolf to his breaking point, while others claimed she knew about his plans and didn't stop him. In the chaos of rumors and political games, the reality that she was as much a victim as anyone's lost. The Merling incident marked a turning point. Stephanie's time as crown princess came to an end, starting a new, tragic chapter in her life. Without the shield of her position, she became disposable to the Habsburg court, which was desperate to distance itself from the scandal and focus on damage control. This young woman, who had already suffered the loss of her health and fertility due to her husband's betrayal, now faced the loss of her identity and place in the world. The aftermath of the Merling tragedy unveiled the harsh truth of royal life. Here, personal relationships were secondary to political needs, and individual pain was often seen as acceptable collateral damage for the sake of maintaining power. The Habsburg court wasted no time in casting aside Stephanie. They acted quickly to limit her involvement in any inquiries or public discussions about the events that had transpired. Essentially, they silenced her, keeping her from sharing her views on Rudolf's mental state or any warning signs that could have hinted at his violent end. While they claimed this was to protect her dignity, it actually shielded the monarchy from difficult truths about the crown prince's behavior and the turmoil in their marriage. The official story spun by the Habsburgs portrayed Rudolf as a tragic figure, crushed by political and personal struggles, while largely overlooking the abuse he had shown towards Stephanie. In the end, she found herself cropped out of her own narrative, her suffering minimized or completely ignored. To maintain Rudolf's image and protect the monarchy, a new version of events quickly took shape. The fallout was swift and ruthless. Former friends at the court distanced themselves from Stephanie, worried that being linked to the widow of a murderer and suicide might hurt their own standing. Invitations to social gatherings vanished, and she found herself more and more alone in her rooms, a constant reminder of a scandal everyone preferred to forget. The young woman once hailed as the future empress was now seen as an outcast. Financially, Stephanie faced tough times too. Her widow's pension was designed to nudge her out of Vienna rather than support a comfortable life at court. The message was unmistakable. The Habsburg family wanted her to fade away, taking any unwanted memories of Rudolf's true self with her. Having her around was an uncomfortable reminder of events the monarchy desperately wanted to leave behind. The psychological burden of this rejection weighed heavily on a young woman who had already faced years of abuse and betrayal. Stephanie had given up her youth, health, and dreams for the Habsburg dynasty, only to be cast aside when the cost became too much for her husband's family. The isolation and abandonment she faced after Rudolf's death marked the final betrayal in a long line of injustices that had shaped her adult life. But the implications of this scandal reached far beyond Stephanie's personal pain. It contributed to the waning prestige of the Habsburg monarchy during a critical time in European history. The empire that once seemed invincible was revealing itself to be as fragile and flawed as its rulers, setting the stage for the disastrous collapse that would unfold during World War I. Despite efforts by court officials to control the story, details of Rudolph's abusive behavior towards Stephanie started to leak into the international press. Foreign newspapers, less restricted by Habsburg censorship, reported on the Crown Prince's affairs, his transmission of disease to his wife, and the ongoing cruelty that marked their marriage. These revelations further tarnished the monarchy's reputation. Stephanie felt immense pressure to stay quiet. The issue of remarriage sparked even more tension between her and the Habsburg court. As Rudolph's widow, she had certain ceremonial roles and financial responsibilities that the imperial family didn't want to pass on to a new husband. The court wanted to keep her stuck, neither fully free nor supported, allowing them to control her while silencing her voice. Years went by, and Stephanie remained in this awkward spot, watching as the empire that wrecked her life slowly began its own decline. The woman who should have been empress found herself lost to history, her tale overshadowed by more appealing stories of imperial glory and tragic love. As the 1890s rolled in, Princess Stephanie showed the strength and resolve that had been hidden during her marriage. She started to step away from the Habsburg court, making choices based on her own needs, not the political whims of her late husband's family. This gradual awakening was her first step toward reclaiming her life, despite the hurdles still in front of her. Everything changed when she met Count Elmer Lon, a Hungarian nobleman who brought her something she had lacked in her first marriage: real affection and respect. Their relationship blossomed slowly, rooted in shared pain and understanding. For the first time since Rudolph, she started to think that happiness could be within reach. But the Habsburg court saw any chance of remarriage as a threat to their carefully crafted story about Rudolph's death and Stephanie's place in the imperial family. Court officials made it clear, if she pursued marriage again, she'd lose her titles, her pension, and any remaining ties to the dynasty that once held her in high regard. The choice was sharp: stay trapped in the decorum of widowhood, or risk everything for a shot at personal joy. The pressure was intense. Stephanie's family made her decision even tougher. Her father, King Leopold II of Belgium, had his own political reasons for wanting her to stay linked to the Habsburgs. This connection was important for Belgium in the complicated world of European politics. He framed his opposition to her remarrying as a matter of duty, but really, it showed he was willing to put politics over his daughter's happiness. Despite this pressure, Stephanie's determination to shape her own future grew stronger. As she matured, she started to see the injustices she had faced. She realized that the people and institutions that had failed to protect her during her marriage couldn't be trusted to look out for her now that she was a widow. This understanding marked a key moment in her journey to independence. However, being Rudolph's widow came with a social stigma that complicated her chances for new relationships. Many potential suitors were scared off by the scandal of her first marriage, while others only saw her as a way to gain royal connections or financial benefit. Finding real love and respect in such a situation required a lot of courage and sharp judgment from Stephanie. Choosing to defy the Habsburgs and seek her own happiness was perhaps the first truly free choice she'd made since arriving in Vienna as a teenager. It meant giving up the security and status of her royal position for an uncertain future built on love and personal fulfillment, a risky move that few women of her time would have dared to make. In 1900, Princess Stephanie made the bold choice to marry Count Elmer Lon, fully aware that this decision would cost her everything the Habsburg court had offered her for keeping quiet and playing along. The wedding was secret to avoid public scrutiny and symbolized both an ending and a beginning, the end of her identity as a Habsburg princess and the start of her life as a private citizen who could make her own choices. The immediate results of her remarriage were just as harsh as the Habsburg court had warned. Stephanie lost her titles, her pension, and her official ties to the Austrian imperial family. By wiping her first marriage and the pain that came with it from history, she became just Countess Lon, a minor noble in Hungary with no special recognition for what she had endured as crown princess. But emotionally and mentally, her new marriage brought a happiness that far outweighed these losses. For the first time as an adult, Stephanie was in a relationship built on real respect and love, not politics and exploitation. Count Lear treated her as an equal partner, not a possession, allowing her to experience the kind of marriage she had always dreamed of having with Rudolf. The couple embraced a quiet life, away from the grand courts and the political games that once defined her youth. This peace was healing after years of trauma, abuse, and being in the public eye. Finally, Stephanie could live for herself, free from the demands of royal duty, which felt more valuable than any title or wealth. Remarrying was Stephanie's way of rejecting the narrative spun around her first marriage and Rudolf's tragic end. By choosing love over obligation, she challenged a system that had sacrificed her well-being for political gain, asserting her right to write her own story. Yet, even in her new joy, the ghost of her past lingered. The scandals surrounding Rudolf's murder-suicide kept following her, and many still watched her with curiosity and speculation about the dramatic events at Meiling. Her second marriage was often compared to the first, with critics suggesting she was dishonoring Rudolf's memory by pursuing happiness with someone else. The timing of her remarriage was significant too, as it occurred during a time of social change and activism for women's rights in Europe. Stephanie's choice to prioritize her happiness over tradition mirrored the rising ideas about women's independence and self-determination, making her both a trailblazer and a symbol of evolving views on marriage and personal freedom. After marrying for the second time, Princess Stephanie started to write down her experiences and memories. At first, it was mainly for her own healing, but over time, she hoped to create a historical record that would capture her side of the story, her perspective on everything that had shaped her life. This memoir project was her way of taking back control, allowing her to share her truth instead of relying on historians and court officials who had never grasped what she went through. Writing her memoir was both healing and hard. It forced Stephanie to revisit some of the most traumatic moments of her life in detail. She wrote about her arrival in Vienna as a hopeful young girl, and how she slowly came to see the real Rudolf. It wasn't easy to talk about the physical and emotional abuse she faced, or the pain caused by his affairs and violence. Still, she felt it was important to document these memories for the future. However, when she reached the part about Rudolf's death and the tragedy surrounding it, Stephanie found herself stuck. The trauma from that time was too fresh, too painful. She just couldn't examine it with the objectivity needed for history. Her writing stopped short at Rudolf's death, creating a gap that showed how deeply she was still suffering and how healing had eluded her. Choosing to end her memoir, there was a powerful statement. It highlighted the limits of her ability to process what had happened and her complicated loyalty to Rudolf. Despite all he had done to her, even years after his death, she couldn't bring herself to reveal the full truth about their marriage and his final violent act. It suggested that some wounds never really heal. Eventually, her unfinished memoir was published after her death, giving readers a glimpse into the reality of royal life behind all the glamorous appearances. Yet, the abrupt ending left many questions unanswered, allowing the official Habsburg narrative to carry on in many historical accounts. This shows how difficult it can be for victims to reclaim their stories fully, even when they have the chance. The gaps in Stephanie's memoir reflect a larger issue in how history is recorded, often sidelining the voices of women and victims. Often, stories like hers fade into the background, overshadowed by narratives that support those in power. Stephanie's fight to share her experiences mirrors that of many women whose pain has been overlooked by mainstream history. Yet, the parts of her memoir she finished shed light on the truth about royal marriages, the toll of illness and abuse on women, and the personal price of political systems that view people as disposable goods rather than individuals deserving respect and care. In her later years, Stephanie found some peace. She and Count Launier stepped back from the spotlight and focused on their own happiness. As they enjoyed their quiet life, the world around them was changing fast. World War I shook things up, leading to the fall of the Habsburg Empire and erasing the political landscape that had once shaped her life. From her safe retreat, she observed the monarchy that had marred her youth fade away. The war brought new challenges, with their land in Hungary caught up in turmoil. The upheavals that followed changed Central Europe's map, stripping away many aristocratic privileges and properties that once provided security. Still, these struggles seemed small compared to the deep scars Stephanie had already carried. As the years went by, she became more reclusive, as if the memories of her past pain only grew sharper with time. Though the joyful moments of her second marriage offered some healing from her earlier losses, they couldn't erase all the suffering she'd endured as a crowned princess. When Count Lon passed away in 1924, Stephanie found herself alone once more. This time, it was a choice that came after experiencing true love and partnership, confirming to her that happiness was still possible, even after betrayal and pain. This realization gave her some solace during her last years, even as she faced the physical reminders of the illness Rudolf had given her. In those final decades, she lived mostly in obscurity, largely forgotten by the world. By the time the 19th century dramas had faded away, the young woman who was once set to be Empress of Austria-Hungary had become just a quiet elderly widow living on less than she once had. Her story was mostly known only to those who still remembered the scandals and tragedies of a long-gone era. Then came World War II, bringing fresh fears and uncertainties. The rise of political extremism and violence reminded her of the chaotic and brutal times she had seen in her youth. The resurgence of fascism and widespread violence in Europe must have felt like a grim repeat of her own life's tragedies, reinforcing her belief that the world was unpredictable and dangerous. Princess Stephanie passed away in 1945, right as World War II was coming to a close, and Europe began to stitch itself back together after yet another devastating conflict. Her death barely made the news. The world was too focused on rebuilding and recovery. The woman whose marriage once made headlines across Europe faded into relative obscurity. Her story mainly remembered only by historians or those connected to the old imperial families. Yet, the legacy of Princess Stephanie's life carries weight beyond her personal hardships. It stands as a reminder of how individual suffering can often get drowned out by political stories and the interests of those in power. Her tale shines a light on how women's experiences have frequently been sidelined in history, their pain and sacrifices overlooked for tidier stories that serve the powers that be. The mistreatment Stephanie suffered at the hands of Crown Prince Rudolf reveals a recurring pattern in history, where those in power exploit and harm those who depend on them. Her story highlights how institutional protections can fail the vulnerable, leaving them without the help they desperately need. The disease Rudolf passed on to Stephanie symbolizes how reckless men have often harmed innocent women throughout the ages. The physical and emotional scars from his betrayal echoed long after the act itself. Her marriage impacted Stephanie's ability to have kids and led to health issues that affected her whole life. The murder-suicide at Meiling is the darkest example of male violence against women, where control and possession are enforced through threats or actual harm. Rudolf's last act wasn't just killing his mistress and himself, it was also the ultimate betrayal of his wife. She was left to deal with the fallout of his actions, often blamed for not stopping it. After this, the social isolation shows how institutions protect themselves, discarding those who become a liability. The way the Habsburg court treated Stephanie after Rudolf's death illustrates how quickly they can turn their backs on someone loyal when it becomes politically tricky. Choosing to remarry for love, instead of living as a widow forever, was her way of resisting an oppressive system that wanted to dictate her choices and define who she was. Though this choice came with its own costs, it gave her a sense of agency and happiness that she had long been denied. The unfinished memoir she left behind symbolizes the struggle trauma survivors face in sharing their stories, even when they want to. The gaps in history aren't just oversight, they reflect the lasting impact of trauma on those who lived it. Princess Stephanie's story confronts uncomfortable truths about power and privilege and highlights how these can obscure rather than prevent suffering. It shows that wealth and status offer no safety from abuse when it comes from those wielding the systems meant to protect us. Yet, her life reminds us that individual strength and the quest for happiness can overcome deep-rooted oppression and betrayal. Despite all she went through, Stephanie found love, asserted her independence, and made sense of her experiences. Her journey proves that the human spirit can not only survive, but thrive against all odds. The aftermath of severe trauma highlights just how relevant Princess Stephanie's story is today. We still see similar situations of abuse, where victim blaming occurs in various places and institutions. The way Rudolph escaped consequences, while Stephanie faced punishment for his actions, mirrors modern cases. Nowadays, powerful people often avoid accountability, while those they hurt are scrutinized and blamed. Understanding Princess Stephanie's experience gives us a glimpse into the roots of today's struggles for women's rights and institutional responsibility. Her story is a strong reminder that progress isn't automatic or lasting. We need to stay alert to stop repeating the cycles that have caused great pain throughout history. As we think about the life of Princess Stephanie of Belgium, we confront deep questions about human nature and the use of power. Her experience pushes us to look at how societies create systems that allow abuse to thrive while shielding the abusers. These patterns seem to stick around through different times and cultures, even amid claims of progress in human rights and social justice. Her tragic journey, from a hopeful young bride to a sick and abandoned widow, and finally to an independent woman reclaiming her strength, shows both the harm of unchecked power and the incredible resilience of the human spirit against systematic oppression. Her story reminds us there are real people behind the grand historical narratives, individuals whose pain and sacrifices often go unnoticed. The medical aspect of her tale, particularly the syphilis that affected her health and fertility, reveals how disease has been wielded as a weapon against women for ages. The shame associated with sexually transmitted diseases has silenced countless women, preventing them from seeking help or speaking out against abuse. Today, these harmful patterns still impact survivors of sexual violence and exploitation. It's the ultimate display of control, when hurting others seems better than letting them be free or happy. Rudolph's murder-suicide wasn't just a personal loss, it was a political statement about how far powerful men will go to keep their grip. They'd rather destroy than lose their power. The way institutions reacted to this tragedy shows how they care more about their own survival and image than about justice for victims. This pattern feels all too familiar in today's stories of abuse and cover-ups. The Habsburg court's treatment of Stephanie highlights how victims endured double harm, first from their abusers, then from the very systems meant to protect them. When she decided to remarry and give up her titles for true happiness, it was a huge act of resistance against a system that wanted to dictate women's lives based on their worth to men. It took immense courage to choose personal integrity over public approval and security. The memoir she left unfinished speaks volumes about the challenges survivors face in sharing their stories. Her inability to complete the account of her trauma reveals just how deeply violence and betrayal can scar the human spirit, wounds that might never fully heal, even decades later. Her journey urges us to reflect on our role in the systems that allow abuse, and to think about how we can better protect those vulnerable to such exploitation. It serves as a reminder that advancing human rights and social justice isn't only about changing laws and institutions. It calls for a deeper shift in how we view power, accountability, and our responsibilities to each other as human beings.